Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, and thank you very much for joining us for this presentation this morning. And a special word of welcome to Mr. Christo van der Rheede. Our guest today was kindly agreed to talk to us on the future of agriculture in South Africa, and I will introduce Christo in a moment. I've just received a little notice that Creamer Media would like to record the presentation, and I see no problem recording. Christo, can I just check with you? Any problem with recording?
No, you're welcome, Prof.
Thank you. And then, so Creamer Media can record the recording. I'm sure it's fine if anybody wants the slides afterwards, that we can make them available. So, because it's a public presentation. So for the good order, how we will run the session, ladies and gentlemen, after I've introduced Christo this morning, he will address us for about 45 minutes. I have to ask all of you to mute your microphones for the session, please. And then if you have any questions, put them in the chat box, and I've asked my colleagues at Wits Business School to collate the questions according to the nature and structure of the questions. They will send them to me, and I will put them to Christo for him to answer. We know from previous webinars of this nature that we get overlapping questions or questions addressing the same area, and by getting a bit of structure in them, it helps to get a flowing discussion. So we are all very excited about this webinar. We had a large number of RSVPs, which gives us the impression that we have a lot of interest in agriculture, and specifically future of agriculture, and then more specifically Christo's role in the future of agriculture at the moment. But all of you joining us, and Christo, again to you, thank you very much for agreeing to address us. So allow me to introduce Christo to the audience this morning. Christo van der Rheede is a former teacher and school principal, has vast experience in training and policy development. As far as qualifications are concerned, he holds a higher diploma in education, a BA degree, a BA honours degree in public and development management, and a master's degree in public administration. He also completed a senior management development program. And as we welcome Christo at WBS, the Wits Business School, today at the University of the Witwatersrand, I'd rather not disclose where Christo completed these qualifications. Christo was appointed as Deputy Executive Director of Agri SA in 2015, and was responsible for Agri SA's Agricultural Transformation Program, National Drought Relief Program, Agri Pakisa Program, Agri BEE program, and other agri development programs. Very recently, in October 2020, Christo was appointed as Executive Director of Agri SA. When I read that in the newspaper, I decided immediately I need to contact Christo, as we know one another personally, and I need to get him to speak at Wits Business School. Christo serves on the board of the Agri CETA and the National Skills Development Council. Christo is also a columnist for various newspapers and for news services. So Christo, it's really a pleasure for us to welcome you this morning. Thank you very much for agreeing to address us here at Wits Business School this morning. We look forward to your presentation. Thanks. Christo, we can't hear you.
Okay, there you go. Can you hear me now?
Thank you. I can hear you, Christo.
Excellent. And good morning to all of our guests. I believe that you are all online to listen to a few comments from my side. But my job this morning is just to give you an overview of the world of commercial agriculture and the future of agriculture at large. So let me go to my next slide. And I wish to focus your attention to something that I call the ninth wonder of the world. Now, some people will say it's our ability to produce food on a large scale, our ability to feed the majority of people in the world. But what is the driver behind all of this? And this is what I call the ninth wonder of the world. This is our ability to move food from point A to point B so that people can have access to food. In South Africa, we are in a very fortunate position in that when food is produced in the Western Cape, it can be shipped overnight to Gauteng markets, and the next afternoon it will be in a very isolated area where people will be able to access food. And this is certainly something that we should never take for granted. But the big question is, how do we improve our logistics? How do we make sure that we transform our logistics? And how do we make sure that we deliver food to all of our people at an affordable rate, but also making sure that food is available on a daily basis? Now, what has saved the world to a very large extent during this lockdown period? We've seen that this pandemic caused quite a wave of stockpiling. The global supply chain worth $8 trillion delivers food to various parts of the world. From field to fork, it accounts for 10% of world GDP. So food is a massive driver of not only making sure that people have access to food, but it also employs approximately 1.5 billion people. In South Africa, agriculture is responsible for employing roughly 800,000 people. That's just for primary agriculture. In other parts of the value chain, I think this number easily grows to in the region of 2 to 3 million people. Global supply of food has nearly tripled since 1970, and that is in line with the growth of world population. We estimate that within the next 10 years or so, by 2030, we will have approximately 9 billion people all over the world. And people need food. And if there's no food, you will know what the consequences of that will be. We've seen large-scale unrest in different parts of the world. And people, when people starve, when people go hungry, then people resort to all kinds of means to get access to food. But this ability to feed the world, to create global supply chains, we've seen the number of people going hungry has fallen from 36 to 11%. A bushel of maize or cut of beef cost less than 50 years ago. So in other words, food has become cheaper, food has become healthier, and food is available on the shelves of our shops and on markets. So what I've referred to earlier as the ninth wonder of the world, that is 21st century logistics. And I think that is a space that we often neglect to understand and to dissect and to identify the many opportunities within that space. Let me continue to the next slide. Markets, ingenuity, and open borders have kept the world fed. This happens despite governments, not because of them. And we were in a very fortunate position in that we were declared as an agriculture sector, we were declared as an essential service. And all that we have then asked government is come help us to maintain our harbors, keep it open, let us ensure that food is moved without any dramatic or draconian regulations from point A to point B, and government has really come to the party. But governments has never produced food. Politicians, with the exceptions of one or two, they are not busy on farms on a daily basis. They are busy with politicking in parliament. So farmers are critical role players in terms of ensuring that food is produced. And I always say it's expertise that feeds this country. It's expertise that drives logistics. It is expertise that ensure that the best quality food reaches our people. And how do we nurture that expertise? How do we grow that expertise in this country? And how do we ensure that we have an inclusive group of expertise that ensure that our people get fed every day? So government's role in terms of food supply, food logistics is limited, and I'm of the opinion let's keep it that way. Yes, they sometimes fix prices, control distribution, or institute tariffs, and that for me, the latter part is the most important part where they actually should focus. On the one hand, how do you protect your own farmers and your own food production system, but at the same time, ensuring that there's balance between imports and exports. But we cannot have a situation where the country is flooded with illegal imports at the expense of our farmers. And we've seen the devastating impact it has had on the sugar industry, on the poultry industry, and many other industries. So big exporters, America, India, Russia, Vietnam, they dominate staples. And another phenomenon that we've been watching with hawk eyes over the last 20 years, we've seen trading firms such as, that's consolidation or monopolization. So trading firms such as Cargill and Cofco, they shift food around the world. On the one hand, that is not a very conducive situation because the last thing that you want is for big monopolies to dictate food supplies and food exports and imports because you want to bring other players into the system. On the other hand, we were quite fortunate. We had very good rains last year. We have seen very good rains in the summer rainfall areas and very good rains in the winter rainfall areas. And that has really, helped us to ensure good harvest and very high stocks to maintain the supply of food. As you can see on my slide, globalization has led to concentration. Half of America's poultry market is now controlled by just 4 firms. In South Africa, the situation is not very much different. So how do we go about to leverage, this concentration, but at the same time build new supply chains so that we have a much more fairer playing field in this regard. In the next 50 years, supply needs to rise by 50% to feed more people. And I've seen amazing things. In the Netherlands, the latest technologies, dairy farms are now being operated on water. In other words, they have boats operating as a dairy farm. We have seen big poultry and big pig producers. Instead of, they operate from triple-story buildings and that's where they have their operations. In places such as Japan, in America, the people go into old industrial areas and they turn these big barnyards or big industrial places into, new agricultural platforms, and we've seen amazing things happen in terms of the quality of especially vegetables which they produce in these big and old dormitories, as which were previously used by your car manufacturers. So let's go to the next slide. We have seen that there's concentration that is happening all over the place. And let me just make this a bit bigger. Can you all see it? Great stuff. All over the world, we've seen that because of this concentration, it creates bottlenecks and all kinds of other problems. In America, slaughterhouses that were responsible for livestock, they had to cut back on their pork supplies. And then ill-considered government actions. Governments tend to protect rather than to open up markets, and that has led to severe food crises. The 2007-2008 food crisis caused a wave of serious challenges in parts of the world. We've seen a wave of riots in parts of the world, from Bangladesh to Mexico, and according to some analysts, it even triggered serious civil war, and that war has been ongoing since that time, and there's no end to it, it seems. So in South Africa, the last thing that we want to cause is a food crisis, and all that I'm saying is let us nurture the expertise that we have to our availability to produce food, to transport food from point A to point B, and leverage that system so that we transform it, bring new players into that space. The reality of climate change, how it caused bad harvest, how bad harvest at the end of the day has a spillover effect in terms of pricing, and that is really something that we have experienced during the drought, severe drought, 2016, 2017, but during 2017 we could turn around our fortunes. We moved our grain production from 7 million tons up to almost 14 million tons. And here's the other issue, fluctuating commodity prices. And a big issue that we're currently experiencing is liquidity in the market. Access to cheap funding becomes a big challenge. We've seen downgrades of South African debt. We've also seen downgrades of the land bank, and the recent downgrade that we've seen on Friday will certainly have a negative impact on our ability to bring new players into the field. I always say you can hand out money or land left, right, and center, but land is not the issue. It's production capital that you require on an annual basis. And if you do not have a financing institution that can provide cheap financing, and right at the start, you not only need cheap financing, you also need grants to enable you to overcome the many challenges in the agriculture sector. With land bank in serious trouble at this point in time, the big question is, how are we going to fund new farmers that want to enter the space, or who are already within the space but who are struggling to access production loans on an annual basis? Because you need production loans, obviously, to buy seed, to buy diesel, to buy all kinds of other things, in other words, to produce food on a farm. We've also seen the impact of this pandemic causing many businesses to close down, and 1 billion household incomes all over the world have been reduced, or they've lost income. And in South Africa, we've seen an ever increasing, what we would call a unemployment rate. So credit has become scarcer, and we've seen also banks are less willing to fork out emergency trade cash, production loans, etc. Then, just to go to the next slide, let me just go there and see if I can do this. Okay, now it's start. Okay, there you go. I think one thing that we must really appreciate is the fact that countries try to avoid a repetition of the 2007-2008 food crisis. 22 members of the World Trade Organization, they have decided to keep the world food system open, and because we are part of a global supply chain. Just to give you some feedback, during the lockdown, big companies like John Deere phoned us and said to us, but they cannot have their big tractors and big harvesters offloaded due to the fact that the harbors were closed. So we had to then engage with government, engage with Transnet to open up Durban Harbour. The boat was returned to Durban Harbour, and we could offload those big equipment for the harvesting season, the maize crop season. And that was the first crisis that we had to manage. The second crisis obviously was to provide what we would call heavy load permits to the companies that were responsible for transporting those big equipment from the harbors inland. And we got the DG of Transport assisting us with opening up the permit offices, and we could transport that equipment to the areas where the harvesting was about to take place. In Cape Town, for example, we not only had a problem in the harbor with COVID instances, but we also had big storms in the Western Cape. And then we had a big issue with ships trying to offload chemicals that was needed to prepare the lands for the winter grain season. But with the help of Transnet, with the help of government officials, we could have that chemicals offloaded, and we've seen amazing harvest in the Western Cape for grains, for example. So yes, that interaction between private sector and the state is of critical importance, because ultimately it's about the people of our country and their constitutional right, which is enshrined in Section 27 of the Constitution, to have access to food. And in that regard, we have got a massive constitutional responsibility that not only rests on government, but on us as a sector as well. The last thing that we have seen during the Trump administration, trade wars, and how it actually ignited the vicious cycle of tit for tat. And South African farmers obviously benefited to a certain extent, because we could then fill that gap that the American farmers, because of the trade war, could not fill. And we've seen massive rise in exports from Brazil, also from South Africa into China. Obviously, with the new administration, it would be interesting to see how things play out. But if you cannot export, then you cannot earn foreign exchange. If you cannot earn foreign exchange, it has a negative impact on your fiscus at the end of the day. And we've seen in South Africa, and sorry that I'm deviating, but we've seen in South Africa, in regions where there is massive exports, how that actually benefit the gross domestic product of that region. Cereals, for example, which are one of the biggest export regions of deciduous fruit, their average GDP sits at between 2.5 to 3% on an annual basis. If you compare that with South Africa's overall GDP rate, then it actually reflects a sad state of affairs. But on the one hand, it also tells a story of opportunities that we miss as a country. The president has alluded to localization. Agriculture is one of the best examples of localization. How do you support the industry? How do you grow the industry? How do you bring large tracts of land that is available all over the country into this space, and also make sure that black farmers are elevated to the next level of commercialization, especially exports to the rest of the world. But in this space, it's reliant on workers that can do a range of tasks, from the most menial tasks right up to the most advanced tasks. America, Europe makes use of over 1 million migrant workers, come from Mexico, North Africa, Eastern Europe. In South Africa, migrant workers move from one province to the other province, also from our neighboring states into South Africa and back home. And it creates a stream of income. It generates not only income that that is limited to a specific area, but that income via labor is distributed to various parts of the SADC region. And for us, it's critical that we uphold biosecurity standards to prevent spread of diseases. We've seen outbreak of various diseases, and that's where government has a critical role to play. Honest support, the Agriculture Research Council and all of these institutions must make sure that we protect our industry from a spread of or from any biosecurity threat that it might face. So interdependency and diversity make a country more food secure. That's why we can never isolate ourselves from the rest of the world. If we want to be a world player, there's two things that count: our ability to produce, to have the necessary products available, and secondly, to make sure that our food is of the highest standard. We can never compromise that, and we must never take it for granted. So let me just see our agricultural ecosystem. Now, I really want to thank BFAP for this very nice picture or diagram that they have developed. So it starts with primary producers, and they make use of a lot of services. As you can see, primary production relies on labor contractors, various services from Eskom, from the municipality, telecommunications, water. They make use of phytosanitary services, veterinary services, and that's the space of primary production. How do we make sure that these services that a farmer rely on, one, is affordable, secondly, it's of the highest standard, and thirdly, that is available to each and every farmer, whether it's a communal farmer, whether it's a small-scale farmer, whether it's a big commercial farmer or a mega farmer, these services must be available. Our various departments, if you just make a rough sum, they have about 12 million people that are employed by, the various, or not 12 million, sorry for that, mistake that I've made, but they've got, in the region of, quite a, I'll just get that figure again, but they've got quite a number of people working in various departments to ensure that these services are provided. We, on the other hand, utilize a lot of services from various, we make use of all kinds of products that are imported from overseas and also other commodities. We don't produce our own rice, for example. We import rice from other parts, especially our Asian countries. Then we import agrochemicals, fertilizers, micronutrients, seed, agri-equipment, packaging materials. And the big question is, how do we then create industries that can produce these products in South Africa or within the southern region, as opposed to being so dependent on importing all of these things from overseas? We've got here in the middle our input processes, our feed processes, our equipment suppliers. And from here, we go into what we would call, these products go into storage. And there we've got other services that play a very important role in the space. We've got auctions where fresh produce are being auctioned, whether it's livestock or, other produce. And then obviously it goes through quite a process. It either goes to ports where we export it to the international world, or it also goes to warehouses from where it's distributed to the informal traders or to the formal traders. And if you do a proper analysis of this entire diagram, the big question is, where are the opportunities for new players to enter? And then you've got various departments. I've already alluded to your land bank. that's responsible for financing, and your other big banks. I've already alluded to the ARC and honest support for veterinary services. And then you need, obviously, your departments of small businesses that can support your workers that are, very active in the space of informal trade, but you also need your DTI to assist with exports to the rest of the world. And perhaps that is our biggest challenge in South Africa. How do we bring all of these various players into one space where we can work in tandem? I think the system to a very large extent is very fragmented. We need to consolidate our efforts. And when I talk about consolidation, there's 5 building blocks for me. The first building block is finance. How do we ensure that new farmers get access to a blended financing mechanism? In other words, a blended financing mechanism that consists of a grant portion and then a cheap financing with a very low interest rate, and then obviously favorable terms over which they can pay back any money that they then loan from a financing institution. The next one is land distribution. We've seen a multitude of reports reflecting on the issue of corruption, the issue of people getting land but they do not have the ability to translate that opportunity into a business opportunity. And that's where a business school, business people, can play a massive role to access those spaces and transform the fortunes of poor people into opportunities that can generate an income from them. Let me go to the next slide, and just to give you an overview of where we stand at this point in time. Gross farm income sits at 277 billion rand. Then we spend a lot of this money on fuel, 13.1 billion, seeds and plants, 10.8 billion, farm feeds, 44.1 billion, maintenance and repairs, 21.1 billion, labor remuneration, 19.7 billion, and then interest paid, 10.5 billion. Now, this figure that you see here, in terms of farming debt, we can safely say farming debt at this point in time sits at about 200 billion rand. Now, and that gives you an indication that food itself is being produced on the back of production loans. You cannot produce any food if you do not have access to finance. So for me, just to go back to what I've alluded to earlier, the 5 building blocks: 1 is finance, secondly, land distribution, making sure that the right people get access to land and that people are assisted. The third building block is extension services. How do we make sure that when people have access to land, that they get extension services on a regular basis? Then the fourth very important part, obviously, is marketing. In other words, access to markets, making sure that people have access to local markets, international markets. If you go around in many towns and many cities, the big question is, how do we transform an informal marketing space into a respectable place where people want to go, where people are feeling safe? And that's so sad that we have not succeeded in translating or transforming our railway stations, our taxi ranks, all of these spaces, municipal areas, into spaces for local markets, where local markets can be established so that your ordinary informal trader can have a space where they can trade. And these opportunities are abound in South Africa. I think it just needs a bit of imagination and a bit of political drive to bring this about. But at the end of the day, the expectation that politics and politicians will do this for us, forget about it. I think business leaders, business-minded people, community, and the word that I often use, the ability to organize themselves economically, that is, the starting point. And that should serve as the trigger to bring about trading spaces where people can trade their goods and services. Export sits at about 109 billion rand. We've been very lucky in that we have not seen major rises in the consumer price index. So food in general, with the exception of a few commodities, we've seen potato prices rising to almost unaffordable prices, but I believe it's coming down again. And then we've seen our industry paying statutory levies to the tune of 600 million rand to the National Agricultural Marketing Council. We've also seen skills levies being paid to Agri by the agriculture industry. So these levies come from the pockets of farmers, commercial farmers out there. About approximately 7,000 of them are paying these levies on an annual basis. And the big question is, how do we ensure that these levies at the end of the day are being used and being channeled in the right direction to build a more inclusive agricultural sector? Then food security. I think there's three things for me that we should never compromise. One, affordability. Our consumers must be in a position to purchase food. And yes, food availability. In other words, sufficiency of national food supply, and then quality and safety. We can never compromise that. And yes, there were, a big battle of ideas during the past COVID months where people said, yes, on the supply side, we've got ample food, but on the demand side, that's where the bigger problem is. How do we then, ensure that we just balance the supply side with the demand side? Obviously, on the demand side, we've seen a massive spike in unemployment. Unemployment is the biggest driver of poverty because people do not have money in their pockets. Government has come up with a few interventions, but those interventions is not sustainable. So how do we get the general economy growing again? How do we exploit the opportunities that exist in this country with imaginative ideas? And how do we ensure that the Wits Business School plays a critical role in empowering young students, business people out there to come with the brightest ideas and to drive the agenda of growth, the agenda of inclusivity. So if you look at this overall index score, South Africa is in a quite fortunate position. We are ranked 48th on this performing index. And then if you look at our African counterparts who have access to land, access to water, with absolutely fortunate in regard of climate, which is very, which is conducive for massive scale agricultural production. The big question is, why are they ranked so low? And that's a question that we can easily answer from the commercial side, because the drive to commercialize agriculture is not really, at the upper part of the agenda in many African countries. And that is where South African farmers and farmers from other countries are moving in to assist those countries with commercialization of agriculture. Because the reality is that your subsistence farmers will never be able to produce enough food to feed an entire nation. Their capability is limited. They can only produce food for at a local level, and in most instances, it is food for their own survival. But we need bigger players in the space to drive commercial output to feed a growing population and world population. If you look at this map, it's very interesting. Singapore, for example, produced very little food. So food production is not necessarily a prerequisite for being food secure. But Singapore has a global supply chain. And I come back to what I've mentioned right at the beginning, the ninth wonder of the world. Logistics can supply Singapore at any minute of the day with food from all over the world. So their food is affordable. Obviously, for us that go and visit there, it is an expensive exercise. But food is available, and they provide quality and safe food, which they import from various parts of the world. South Africa, on the other hand, is in a precarious space because we're one of the driest countries in the world. We are also a country where you don't have a lot of arable land, but we've got some of the best farmers in the world. And how do we leverage that expertise to grow and supply food to the rest of the world? Then the next slide that I quickly want to refer to, livestock, for example. Livestock's value sits at 122 billion rand. And there's examples of crops that are being produced by the livestock sector, or not crops necessarily, products, that's beef, poultry, and wool. But we've got challenges. And as I've said earlier, the issue of biosecurity is a big challenge for us, and the issue of rising local feed prices. I hope with a good maize crop that we've had, we can bring down the feed prices as well. Cereals sits at 53 billion rand. Wheat, maize, sorghum, soya beans, and obviously climate change and rainfall unpredictability is a bit of a challenge. But we've seen very good seasons for this year and for next year and also last year. Vegetables, potatoes, green, carrots sits at 25 billion rand. Those are just examples. But how do we unlock the water and irrigation infrastructure, especially for up-and-coming farmers? I always say we sit with this massive sea around us. Take off the big cities, take them off the water grid, and provide them with water from the sea, and make that water available through a sophisticated irrigation system towards your existing farmers and your new farmers that want to enter the space. Municipalities often fail to maintain their water infrastructure. Government departments often fail to plan properly, and that's where the bigger challenge lies. Imagine where we can be, what we can achieve as a country, if government plays their part, if commercial farmers play their part, if the value chain is further expanded and leveraged to bring in new players in the space. And citrus have been in heaven these past few months. We've seen massive exports to the Asian countries, oranges, lemons, all of these things. And obviously there we see also the issue of water and irrigation infrastructure, which is a big concern. And then, last but not least, reinvestment in logistics infrastructure. Our port management, our cold storage change, also the protection of our drivers. We've seen ridiculous, and it is ridiculous, the economic sabotage that has taken place on Friday night, on Saturday night, with 26 trucks were just gutted. Who are these people? Why are they doing it? And I think the issue of law and order needs to become part and parcel of our emphasis, because you cannot grow economy, you cannot grow your industries if people that drive these activities, and those are entrepreneurs, if there's uncertainty, if there's insecurity, if there's a general breakdown in law and order, and if there's an issue in terms of infrastructure, maintenance, and planning. In this regard, I must commend Transnet, because they play a big role to turn that around. So opportunities, let's see where the opportunities sit. Right at the top, there's a little key, and good means green, or green means good, yellow means suboptimal, and poor means pink. And here we've seen, where the bigger opportunity sits. Vegetables, beef, maize, poultry are in good spaces, but obviously citrus, fortunates have been changed, deciduous fruit also, but that's where bigger opportunity sits. And obviously poor subtropical fruits, how we do we turn that around? Wheat, because of the fact that we have to invest lots of money to deliver on wheat production. How do we then bring down the cost, not of your input materials, but also the cost of doing business? And I think if we can get that mix right, you then at the end of the day can expand production in all of these areas. So that's just a macroeconomic overview. And then obviously in terms of trade, South Africa has established itself as a net exporter these past few months, or not, say from 2015 onwards. And we've seen the export of fruit, citrus, deciduous fruit, also subtropical fruit, vegetables, beef, all of these things are being exported. The bigger challenge, obviously, is poultry. And there has been engagement with government to increase the tariffs on poultry dumping in South Africa. And obviously, you need to be very balanced in your approach, because the last thing that you want is a trade war between us and other countries. Then they block our exports because we block their imports. But we need an environment where fair trade, is at the order of the day. You cannot have a situation where people just dump food all over Africa just to get rid of their own excess stock at the expense of your local farmers. And then in terms of labor intensity, we've seen very good labor uptake in the fruit industries, because those are intensive industries, vegetables. Obviously, in other industries, your labor intake is low. But how do we make sure that labor at the end of the day do not become too expensive? And I'm very upfront about this, because all that happens if labor becomes too expensive in the agriculture industry, people start to mechanize. And because, we sit with a massive unemployment problem in this country. So how do we ensure that the cost of labor, the cost of doing business in general, the cost of imports, do not, at the end of the day, erode the profitability of any farming enterprise? Because as an entrepreneur, and I believe all of you are entrepreneurs in your own way, all that you do is you're going to look at the bottom line, and you're going to cut costs to increase your profitability, because profitability in this game is everything. Without being profitable, you're going to face massive, massive challenges. And with capital becoming so expensive, if you're not profitable, you're going to even face more challenges when you go to a financial institution for production loans. These are just the realities of agriculture and an agricultural sector that plays in the space of the global supply chain. So challenges. We've seen, and this is a map from Stats SA, massive poverty in particular areas in South Africa, especially in your areas which were called Bantustans. And sadly, though, we haven't actually succeeded in unlocking the agricultural opportunities, the industrial opportunities, etc., in these areas. And what happens? People migrate from these areas into other areas. We've seen massive migration to cities all over South Africa, massive migration to commercial production areas, because people are looking for money in their pockets. People are leaving land behind that they have available to them to produce their own food in search for money, because money at the end of the day and a good income at the end of the day improves their ability to create a better future for themselves and for their children. And this is the areas where we should start to focus. What are the agricultural opportunities in these areas? And we've done our own research, massive, massive potential. But the big problem is infrastructure. The big problem is obviously funding, production loans, and then thirdly, the big question of who is the owner of the land. As long as the state is the owner of the land, it makes it so difficult for people to put up land as collateral. And obviously, the last thing that you want is for people to go sell the land off because they can't make a living on the land. But that is not insurmountable. We need to come up with great ideas. How do we ensure that we put a mixed bag of things that can serve as collateral for these farmers to access finance? And land is but part of it, but what are the other tools or other things that we can bring into that mixed bag of things that they can offer to a bank as collateral. What are those things? For example, offtake agreements, partnerships with commercial farmers, you name it. I always say it's the lack of ideas that keeps South Africa behind. With the expectation this morning is that as Wits students, as students of business, of economics, that you guys need to come up with these ideas. In terms of water availability, and that's the interesting part. If you look at these poverty-stricken areas, the water is there. How do we then unlock that water? Because water, you cannot farm without water, whether it's via irrigation system or you being dependent on rain. How do we create a water infrastructure in South Africa second to none? So we unlock the potential of agricultural land and turn the fortunes of many, many poor people in South Africa. If you look at government's interventions, government currently sits on 5,407 farms. I think this number has increased. The big challenge is what is happening on those farms. I've been visiting some of those farms. It was sad to see the dilapidation, the lack of production on those farms, also the severe losses in terms of employment on those farms and in terms of contribution towards the local GDP. And we cannot continue this way because we are facing serious challenges, with a growing population and with a with food, a lack of food at the end of the day. And that we have to keep in mind. We have to hold government to accountable, but I always say, what is the contribution that we as an industry can make to turn around the fortunes of people that are farming on this land, and how do we help them? And how do we bring expertise? You can recall, I said right at the start, we need expertise in the space. It's expertise that drive logistic systems. It's expertise that drive food production on a commercial basis. It is expertise that ensures that we export the best quality food to the rest of the world. And by doing so, we earn foreign exchange for the country. And we keep our government, our fiscus afloat. So how do we, as a student of economics, a student of business, go with a plan to government that says, listen, we are these 5,000 farms. How do we train? And that's the last building block that I want to mention. But in fact, it should be the first building block. How do we ensure that people are well trained, that people have the necessary financial savviness, financial expertise to make a success on these farms? So solutions. One, we need to maximize commercial agricultural output. It's commercial agriculture that have saved this country from serious problems during the past few months. Sadly, though, I received phone calls from clergymen in Zimbabwe, clergymen in Mozambique that beg us for some kind of intervention because people are starving in those countries. We cannot afford that similar situation to play out in South Africa. So commercial agriculture is of critical importance. But at the same time, we need to leverage the opportunities that commercial agriculture provide. We need to leverage that to build a new cohort of farmers. I want to move away from the concepts of, a small-scale farmer, subsistence farmer, to a commercial farmer. I want to talk about professional farmers. How do we professionalize the agricultural industry? And yes, there are pockets of excellence, pockets of professionalization or professionalism, but at the same time, I want to see a farmer on 1 hectare of land where they produce greens for Woolworths. I want to see them professionalize. Right up to the big mega farmers. We need a cohort of professional farmers that understand their responsibility towards the economy, towards the socio-economic environment, the economic environment, socio-economic environment as well. as the environmental environment. If I have to cluster the two words together, because we need to take care of the environment. We have a socio-economic responsibility towards our workers, towards local communities, towards South Africa, the SADC region, and the world at large. But certainly, we also have a responsibility towards, the external economy, but also in terms of our own business operations, making sure that we operate at a level where we maintain our profitability. And then improve access to financing, making sure that we make cheap funding and a mix of blended financing available to farmers, ensuring that there's investment in infrastructure, because without infrastructure, you can have the best produce in some part of South Africa. But if you cannot get that product to the market overnight, then that product will start to rot on your field, and then you will lose a lot of money. Commitment to transformation, that is absolutely critical, but government has a role to play to create conducive circumstances, because without money, without proper financing, our black farmers will remain at a level where they are struggling, and that must come to an end. Funding is critical. And then obviously global trade optimization. How do we ensure that? I've just got off the phone this morning from one of the South African ambassadors. He is ambassador in some Asian country. And he says the opportunities are galore. But instead of South Africa produce being on the markets in that particular Asian country, is produce from Australia, Chile, and Spain and other countries. And we need to start opening those doors. We export because it is via exports where we can create a truly global, competitive, and sustainable agricultural sector. And then obviously, last but not least, Thomas Edison, I'm not sure whether he has mentioned these words. I've just seen it on the internet. Opportunity is missed by most people because it is dressed in overalls and looks like work. And I want to emphasize this. Forget about it. I speak to many students, and they always ask me, sir, I've got land somewhere in South Africa. But I want to work in Joburg because I love the nightlife. I want to be with my friends. Can I operate like this? I said, if you want to create a fortune, a big fortune in agriculture, it will turn overnight into a small fortune if you want to operate like that. We need farmers on a 24-hour basis on our farms. And yes, it's hard work. It's not glamorous work. You smell like a pigsty. You drive a bakkie that's falling apart. You have got a khaki shirt that hasn't been washed in a few days. I'm not trying to stereotype here, but that's the only way I can distinguish a real farmer from a office-bound farmer. And so Africa doesn't need office-bound farmers. We need farmers that are dedicated to the land, farmers that build their expertise over many generations, and yes, farmers that are progressive in their thinking, in their outlook, and that want to build a new system that have two fundamentals in place, or two driving forces in place. One, that is to grow the sector, and secondly, to grow or to build an inclusive sector so that all of our people benefit from this sector that has been a saving grace for South Africa during the past few months where we were in lockdown, but we still continue to feed the nation. What a privilege it is. I thank you, Prof, and thank you, team at Wits, and thank you to all our guests who have been listening very patiently.
Christo, thank you very much for an excellent presentation. I've looked at some of the remarks in the chat box as you were speaking. This is an excellent presentation, which we really enjoyed. So thank you very much for engaging with us this morning. We know that you have a very busy program. We've made an agreement that we will allow you to leave just before owing to other commitments. We've also agreed that we will group questions together. So we have a few questions by now. The one is, what are the implications of the medium-term budget policy statement, the Mtbps for agriculture, which will, as we've seen from your presentation, continue to play a pivotal role in poverty alleviation and economic growth? What are the implications for the next 5 years? Please, Christo, if you can elucidate.
Prof, let me be blunt. South Africa hasn't got money. If you study that medium-term budget, we've got a massive deficit. It's growing by the minute. Secondly, we've got a massive issue in terms of the downgrades that occurred over quite a long period. And on Friday, it was really the death knell in the proverbial coffin. And then, what is the implications with Treasury that have no money? Land Bank that has been playing a critical role. Land Bank currently, has about 30% of all production loans that they they're responsible for. And if Land Bank is facing serious challenges, Land Bank has been downgraded, I think, earlier this year. Secondly, they've got a stack of non-performing loans to the tune of 6 billion rand. But more so, we have hoped that the Minister of Finance would have made a serious commitment towards the Land Bank. But he only said, and that's where his words, he said the following. He says, Land Bank requires 7 billion rand. Now, the big question is, it requires 7 billion rand. So, Minister of Finance, are you going to make that money available? And then the minister jumps to the next paragraph in the Mtbps, and they said that they will make 10 billion rand available to South African Airways. And that really, is not on. We need to decide whether we want to fly or whether we want to eat. I think the choice is it's easy. If we do not, the Mtbps doesn't address the issue of financing to Land Bank. There is no commitment. And yes, I would like to know, where do we stand at this point in time from Treasury side? Hopefully, money is being channeled towards the Land Bank. But if the Land Bank doesn't get funding, then it will be a massive setback for not only for commercial farmers, but for the cohort of black farmers that are entering the space. Because money from your commercial banks are far too expensive. And the criteria is really, really challenging, because you really need to have quite a track record if you want to get being helped by your... But we need to come up with a plan. And that plan won't come from government. That plan must come from the industry. And yes, we are in the process of developing these plans. We are throwing ideas around, but we would like to engage with the president at a later stage and says, Mr. President, here's the plan from the commercial agriculture. We want to take responsibility for it, but we cannot take responsibility for it as long as we face particular challenges from government side. There's very few challenges. I always say we've got to see a habit of scoring own goals, as opposed to trying to score a goal that can put us in, that can make us a winning team. And we need a winning approach. Currently, we're losing big time.
So thank you, but you give us a stark choice. Do you want to fly or do you want to eat? And the answer is obvious. People have to eat. You give us a stark choice. I must remember this one for future debates. Christo, there's a question on government's short-term plan for economic recovery post-COVID is focused on infrastructure, energy, industrialization. Where does this leave agriculture in this mix, especially in view of your remark, people must eat?
I think all of these plans by government is excellent. I've been studying the APAP plan that we produced a couple of years back, the National Development Plan, Chapter 6, great ideas. I've been part of Agri Pakisa We are now busy with the master plan. You know, in agriculture, there's no shortage of plans. The big challenge is implementation, and it applies to infrastructure development as well. We really want a massive effort to start implementing these plans. Without implementing these plans, we will continue down this downward path, you know, where we every second year we get a group of people together. Right, come guys, write a plan. But we never, you know, get to a space where we start implementing these plans. And we know the problems when it comes to implementation. And from my point of view is we are no longer waiting on government. We have seen the plans. We support many of the plans. But I think the responsibility now rests on the sector in collaboration with other business sectors. And we already have good relations with mining, for example. It's a bit of an antithesis, but mining is making land available. We are in collaboration with you know, other institutions making land available so that we then translate the opportunities that land present into a viable economic you know, opportunities.
Thank you, Christo. The next question is really a very practical one. I run a children's home that is on a plot with potential for vegetable gardening and poultry farming. I would like to be connected to a mentor to start and create a poverty alleviation program that will help us to be sustainable. A very practical question, but perhaps a question in many persons' minds. This one person has now put it under these specific words, but perhaps a question in many people's minds. Can you elaborate on mentoring or other assistance programs, please?
Prof, the first thing that I want to mention is the cost of doing such a project. You know, we tend to become very idealistic. I was there many years ago. I come from the University of the Western Cape, and there we were fed very good Marxist ideals and Marxist ideas. And when I went to, you know, some university, I won't call its name for obvious reasons, Prof, and there I learned the word profit. Gee whiz, and the word profit is an ugly word at that point in time. How is it possible that, you know, all of these Marxist ideals that we grew up with, there's the word such in that space. In fact, it's a word from the devil. And the big thing is, you know, why I mention it is the fact that any idea, whether it's to start a food garden at the school or at the creche, wherever, you need to understand the economics behind it. Because one, water, availability of water. Municipal water is expensive water. That's your first cost driver. The second driver is obviously security. You don't want people to break in and come and steal your stuff. Thirdly, the cost of seed, the cost of fertilizer, the cost of labor, all of these things. And yes, all of us start up with good ideas. But when those cost drivers start to erode the ideal, then after a year or two, what do you see? You just see a dilapidated area where there was once a food garden. So that is critical. Do your homework properly. I often say, many people ask me, Christo, I want to become a farmer. And I said, my friend, have you been at an agricultural college? Have you studied agriculture? Do you understand the sacrifices that you have to make to become a successful farmer? And do you understand, you know, what are the risks? And start with the risk itself. I said, first go and do your homework properly, then you come back. But, you know, when it comes to mentorship, I think you cannot, a mentorship cannot be a one-sided affair where you sit back and then a mentor have to mentor you and then you try your luck at the business that you want to dabble with. You need to become part of the mentoring. You must be an integral part of the mentoring. You must do your homework first. You must put in skin in the game. This thing that where we just give people everything for free, it hasn't worked. It will never work, right? It cannot work because the commitment is not there. So if you have skin in the game, if you have done your homework, then yes, like it is easy to identify a mentor. And you can contact Agri SA and we will put you into touch with, we've got the commodity organizations that in itself provides opportunities for mentoring. We have the various provinces. One can, tap into the knowledge base there and find out who are prepared to be a mentor. And then you've got the various institutions, universities, colleges, agricultural colleges, agricultural schools all over the country. Get in touch with particular mentors there. But it must be a tango. In other words, you cannot expect of the mentor to dance alone. You need to take his hand, you need to form a partnership, and you need to make sure that you listen carefully and implement and make a success of it. But do your homework first.
So thank you very much. We've focused a lot on edible commodities today, rightly so, and therefore I want to raise this very interesting question about the cotton industry, which is still an agricultural product but with a different use. The question is there an opportunity to grow a cotton industry in South Africa in view of the fact that there seems to be a problem with quality of cotton for clothing industry? So this is a different type of agricultural product, and I thought therefore an interesting question to focus on that angle.
Prof, I've seen the statistics. Before 1994, we had a massive cotton industry because the cotton industry supplied cotton, and we had cotton mills, and they supplied cotton to our clothing sector. Now, you know that in Cape Town, there was a very big clothing industry, the same in Port Elizabeth. I'm not sure in what other parts, but I also know in Newcastle. Came 1994, we then decided to do away, one, with agriculture subsidies. We forgot that there's a cohort of black farmers that will need subsidies to be able to compete in the space. Secondly, we signed free trade agreements left, right, and center. And in the process, yes, all that happened was your commercial agriculturalists, they grew from strength to strength because they benefited from these trade agreements. But at the same time, we did away with, we almost closed down our agriculture sector. And because our our clothing sector, clothing manufacturing sector, most of those factories in Cape Town closed down, and so in other parts of the world. Because there was low levels of demand for cotton, the cotton industry was also facing severe challenges. But we've seen Cotton SA, Jannie Brouwer, them doing great work in that space. They've got huge investments with Mr. Price, for example, in areas, Mpumalanga areas, where cotton growers, especially black cotton growers, are benefiting from this project. And we've seen our own clothing sector is picking up again. But I just want to mention the wool growers in South Africa. They made amazing intervention, to grow black wool growers. Wool growers in South Africa export wool to China mostly, and we've seen a bit of a downturn, but overall, what did the wool growers do? They didn't invest a lot of money in the sector. All that they did was they brought on board good rams with the best DNA. And that project, we call it the RAM project in the Eastern Cape. That project has resulted in almost 4,000 black farmers exporting wool to Asian countries. And because of that, a lot of downstream jobs were created because now suddenly you needed people to classify the wool. And that's why South African wool, reaches good prices on the open market. But there's simple interventions that the industry is putting on the table to turn around the fortunes of the industry itself, but also to grow a new cohort of farmers that have been excluded from it in the past. But the same with credit boards, the same with the land bank. We've turned land bank into a fully fledged financial institution with no assets. Now, how is that possible? Land bank doesn't have any assets. Their product range is very limited. If we really want to, if we are really serious about transformation in the sector, growing an inclusive sector, I think we must go back to the days of the credit boards. We must go back to some form of subsidy. We must do exactly what the Americans and the Europeans are doing. No wonder their agriculture sector is flourishing. But you need very focused and very targeted interventions from government, not this kind of, then we have this plan, then we have that plan, then we have this idea, then we have that idea. No industry can grow on the basis of the politicians when they wake up in the morning, then they suddenly have an idea and then they feel that that idea must be implemented. It must have a solid basis on which the future prospects of that industry is being built. That's the only way that we can grow this sector.
Thank you. We have a lot of interesting questions. I am cherry picking. I have to say to the audience, I know Christo is pressed for time, so I'm doing cherry picking. That's the one advantage I have in this debate. Now, there's a very interesting question about the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement recently being signed, now being ratified by the various countries. A very interesting question. How do you see the South African agricultural sector benefiting from the African Continental Free Trade Area? A very topical, a very relevant question. Your views, please, Christo.
Well, I think the biggest advantage it provides is for us to export expertise to the rest of Africa. We have allowed that space to be filled by other countries. We have neglected Africa. I'm honest when I say that. And we've allowed politicians to run amok, with all kinds of policy positions that have not really benefited African people. And that is very, very sad. So, yes, we should export expertise. We can use the agreement to advocate particular policy positions that we know that works or that work. And then thirdly, we need to conclude fair trade agreements, because in the space, if you're dominant, if you have very good expertise within your midst, you're going to overshadow any other players within the space. So fair trade agreement is very, very necessary. And then, yes, within the space, I think what we need to understand is how do we then, forge partnerships between various countries within this space, because that obviously is the bigger challenge. Another agreement in place, but we've seen our borders remain closed for exports and imports, or not closed necessarily, but it's so restrictive. And then the issue of socioeconomic stability, the rise of all kinds of crimes within the space, that at the end of the day impacts on our ability to export. And then, yes, how do we manage our border post? I've seen lots of complaints from truckers that they almost stand for days on end just to get through Komati Poort or any other border post. So any agreement is as good as what is happening at an operational level. And we need to address those stumble blocks because we won't get very far if we don't address particular stumble blocks. Infrastructure, border post, the issue of crime, the issue of fair trade, the issue of allowing South Africans to do business in other parts of Africa, but also allowing cross-border, migrant labor and all these kinds of things that are critical. Just on that note, we've been trying very hard to create or establish a cohort of wool shearers in South Africa. But to no avail, because it's backbreaking work. Most of our wool shearers come from Lesotho, for example, and for them it's a massive income that they take back home. But if you have problems with cross borders, if you have problems with visums, if there's no real political commitment to iron out the challenges that we have, then that agreement will not be worth the paper it's written on.
Thank you. I'm very cognizant of your time, Christo. It seems to me we have time for one more question before I want to thank you. There is an interesting question around uncertainty with land policy in South Africa, land ownership in South Africa, expropriation, etc. The question is, what is the future of agricultural investment in South Africa with increasing uncertainty around policy with regard to land? Your views, please, Christo.
Prof, I'm very clear about it. We've had a terrible past that excluded people from agriculture, that also took land away from them. And we need to restore people's rights to land. That, for me, is critical. But we've seen a land reform and land restitution program for the past, decade or two that has not really achieved that outcome. One, I think there must be a renewed effort from all role players that have access to large tracts of land to, one, make that land available to new farmers. And the government has now tried to come up with a process. The 700,000 hectares of land, they prescribed a process for land to be transferred to people. They've received applications and they're busy verifying it, and there's a particular criteria. But we've now discovered that there's already people on that land. That brings me to the second question, the issue of ownership. We've seen if you don't own a property, you will remain poor for the rest of your lives. My grandfather, and I want to share the story just to emphasize the point. My grandfather had a farm in the Overberg district. The farms produced not a lot of things, but he was the owner of that land. It belonged to him, and that enabled him to establish a whole lot of businesses on the missionary stations there in the Western Cape. When Grandpa passed away, he, he mustered he saved a lot of money over time. And that money, at the end of the day, enabled us as a family, and we were quite a big family, to go to university and to go complete our studies. And that can directly be traced back to the fact that Grandpa owned a piece of land. It was written on his name. With my background, I could build a house for myself with money that I got from the bank. And that time I was quite lucky. We received 100% bank loans. And after 30 years, I then sold the house for a nice profit and I invested in another property. Why are we continue perpetuating a system that deny, especially Black people, from owning a piece of land? Why do we continue with a communal system with land owned by churches, large tracts of land owned by the state and by municipalities? Why can't we turn around the fortunes of Black people by giving them ownership of a piece of land, whether it's for residential purposes, whether it's for industrial purposes or for agricultural purposes? For me, that is something that people often shoot holes through, because they say ownership of land doesn't necessarily mean that you can create wealth for yourself, but it places you in a better position to create wealth for yourself as opposed to somebody that is not in that position. I know of my colleagues that have been coming from communal areas, teaching in the Western Cape for many years. They receive their pension package, they go back to the Eastern Cape, for example, in a communal area, they built a house of 1 million rand just to discover, but that market value of that house, is not what it is supposed to be if that house was built in an area where that person owns that little piece of land, whether it's 500 square meters, 10 hectares of land, or 20,000 hectares of land. We need to find a way to promote ownership. I believe ownership lays the basis for wealth creation. And we must do it, we can do it. Land is not the issue in South Africa. The issue is ownership, and we need to protect ownership. We cannot compromise ownership. If you want to see an agriculture sector being destroyed in no time, then you must start to fiddle with ownership. And secondly, we must invest heavily in infrastructure, water infrastructure, all of those things. The opportunities lay bare in our country. And the funny thing is, who are the people who pick up these opportunities? It's not South Africans. It's people from other countries. If you go into the spaza shop domain, that domain is now dominated by Somalis and by Chinese and by people from other countries. Now, yes, we're an open country. We're part of a global value chain. But at the same time, how is it possible that our own people fail to see these opportunities? And you know what? It comes back to one crucial mindset. And that's our ability, or our lack of ability, to organize ourselves economically. We are very good at political organization. We can in no time group a lot of people and say, right, we go on a march today and we are going to fight about service delivery. Or we're going to go and vote for a specific party. And we're very good at that. And there's nothing wrong with it. We come from a particular history. But we fail to organize ourselves economically. And that's how do we congregate or bring ourselves into business formations. In other words, where's the Soweto business chamber? Where is the agricultural formations that drive a business agenda as opposed to a political agenda? But more so, how do we corporatize these institutions? Corporatize, I don't talk about cooperatives where we have 5 people and they struggle to make a living. I talk about corporatization. That's where the business school, with all of their business expertise, their business students, can come together and say, guys, let us form a corporate, agricultural corporate. Let us bring our funding together in the space and let's do our own thing. We must stop being reliant on government or somebody else. It's about the future. And if you fail to position yourself as an independent thinker, as a person that can organize yourselves economically, then you will stay at the mercy of those who are in very powerful positions and treat you as a mere consumer or as a mere, or as mere political fodder.
So, thank you very much. I'm very cognizant of your time. I know that you have to travel. So I do apologize to the people who raised questions that we didn't touch on. I tried to group them together to cover most of the material. For the time you've spent with us this morning, we are most grateful. We know your time is very valuable. So thank you very much. This is the occasion where we would have handed you the gift of the handshake if we were at Wits. So this is the gift of the handshake. We really appreciate your time. We thank you for excellent presentation. Your presentation instills hope in South Africa's future. It's a presentation that instills hope about a future for a successful country. We had a large number of attendees, which shows the interest in this presentation and in agriculture. And I trust that you've in a similar way instilled hope in all the other people that attended. So big thank you, and also a big thank you to your staff at Agri SA, our staff at Wits Business School who made this happen, who made this possible. On your side, please convey the thanks to your staff, and to the WBS staff, thank you very much. And then lastly, Christo, good luck for the major responsibilities ahead of you as Chief Executive Officer at Agri SA. It's a very important position in the structure of South Africa. The best wishes of WBS, all of us, all our stakeholders, our best wishes accompany you, and we hope everything goes well for you. Good luck. And thank you very much for sharing time with us.
Thank you, Prof. Thank you to every listener. And from our side, let us remain focused, let us remain positive. Your negativity will take us over the brink of collapse. We need to remain positive. We need to work together. We need to ensure that we stay together as a nation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks.